Welcome to Module Monday. Module Monday is a video series where I look at a cool PowerShell module each Monday. This Monday, we're looking at Pester. Pester is a test framework for PowerShell. Most PowerShell users probably are aware of Pester even if they haven't used it. It actually comes inside the box in terms of Windows machines as a module that's pre-installed. But today we're going to be looking at Pester 5, which is the new version of Pester. I hadn't had a chance to play with Pester 5, so I took the opportunity to learn a lot more about Pester 5 while making this video. So I'm kind of getting into the details of what Pester is and how to use Pester and why you use Pester. And then we're going to kind of look at some of the new features of Pester 5. So if you check out the Pester GitHub page, you'll actually see a full rundown of all the Pester 5 changes, and you can learn a lot more about how to use Pester just from the README here on the Pester GitHub page. But we're going to get into some examples, and we're going to kind of go through why you use Pester, and then a bunch of the different features of Pester, and then some of the difference between Pester 4 and 5. So be aware that you'll have to install Pester 5 from the PowerShell gallery. It will not come pre-installed in Windows anymore. It's there, but it's not the PowerShell or Pester 5 version. All right, so let's look at some basic usage of Pester. So I have a function here called newThing, and what newThing does is it just returns a string thing. So in a very basic scenario, what you can do with Pester is you can use a couple of the keywords such as describe, context, and it to kind of outline tests for your function or module. So in this case, I want to describe newThing, and I want to validate that it should return a thing. So this is a very simple test case for a pretty much a Pester test. And what we can do here is we can actually say new thing should be thing. So the idea here is I'm validating that my function works the way it should work. And a couple kind of syntactical things that you need to realize are the describe is kind of the outer block to describe a particular piece of functionality that you're testing. And then an it block is more or less an individual test case for that particular describe block. So it kind of reads like in English here, which is kind of nice. And then inside this script block test, what we're doing is we're going to execute our new thing function. And then we're going to call should, which is an assertion. So that's going to assert that our function returns thing. So if I just hit F5 on this, you'll see down at the bottom in the terminal that I had one test pass. So that means that my thing pretty much returned correctly. Similar to other assertions, you can also do like not operators. So there's a bunch of different pretty much assertions that you can make with should. So should, if you look at this, it has be, not, because, be exactly, be greater than, all different kinds of comparisons you can do for values that you pipe to it. So in this case, we don't want it to be thinger. So now if I run these, you'll see that I have two tests pass because it returns thing and it doesn't return thinger. There's another level that you can kind of define within your Pester tests, and it gives you another kind of scope. So for example, you could have describe and then a context. So you might have two different contexts for how you call the thing. Since we just have one context, for this particular example, we could just do something like this. But it allows you to kind of have a describe for an individual function or something like that, and then a context for various ways you may call the function. You might have different parameter sets, that kind of thing. So you might have two different contexts, or you might have different kind of like runtime environments that you want to kind of configure for this context. And then if I run that, you'll see that again, I have two tests. It just ran in that context. All right. So one thing I want to kind of mention about Pester 5 is it works a little different than Pester 4 in terms of how it executes. So Pester 4 only had one kind of way it executed. It would just discover the test during execution of the tests, which meant that you could run you could run your tests in a certain way to provide variables and that kind of thing. But Pester 5 now has a two-stage kind of execution. And you'll notice that in the output down here, the first stage is discovery. So it actually goes out and discovers the test first. And then the second stage is it actually goes and runs the tests. So since it has this discovery stage, it means you have to write your tests a little bit differently than you did in PowerShell or Pester 4. But it also means that we can do a lot of cooler things with Pester 5. And the first really cool thing that we can do is you can actually, if you get the PowerShell VS Code extension, the preview extension for VS Code. So I have that installed. You'll see that I have PowerShell preview. And then if you go into settings, so I'll go into the settings UI, and if you search for code lens, what you're going to see is there is a PowerShell use legacy code lens setting here. It's checked by default so that it works with PowerShell 4, but if you disable it, it will work with PowerShell 5 and later, or Pester 5 and later. And what that gives you is this. So you have these little buttons now. So I have run test, debug tests, run test, debug tests for each one of the different kind of sections of code here. So the idea being that because we have test discovery now and not just execution, we can have cool tools like this. It also means that we can run specific tests. So you couldn't do something like this necessarily before, where I just wanted to run this one test, and you could see that down here, it ran the single test that I selected. And this also integrates with the debugger, so you can see that if I click debug test, it will break in the debugger. All right, so let's kind of jump a little bit deeper into some of the aspects of Pester that are a little bit different between 4 and 5. First, I'll show you kind of an indication of the difference between discovering and running. So, like I said, you have to write your tests a little bit differently because of how discovery works. So in Pester 4, what you could do is you could set variables inside this describe block and that kind of thing, and then you could use those in your it block. But in Pester 5, you don't want to do that because that code will actually execute during discovery rather than run. So if we give this a run, what you'll see in the bottom here is that this write host that says discovering actually runs during the discovery process. So if I were to set a variable in there or create a mock or something like that, it wouldn't actually be available in the run during the running of the test because you can see down here after discovery happens, we don't see discovering again. We only see running. So this, because it's outside of kind of any block such as an it block or a before all or before each block, which I'll show in a second, it doesn't run during the test run. It only runs during discovery. So just be aware that that is not kind of the proper way to do things now. The correct way to do things is actually to use before all, before each, after all, and after each. So these run kind of as they state before all tests, before each test, after all tests, and after each test. So if we add a few more tests into this context here, what we can do is we'll see that if I run this, you'll see that we have the before all, it runs once at the beginning, and then we have before each, we have the first test, after each, before each, and then so on and so forth, and then after all runs at the very end. So in that way, you can kind of configure your tests kind of, as you see fit. And this will be in the correct scope of the test. And any variables you define and that kind of thing will be available inside your tests. So as an example of that, let's actually go and tweak this a little bit again, just so we can see variables being defined in the same scope using before all and before each. So what I'm actually going to do here is in before all, I'm going to call get random, and I'm going to store this random all variable. And then in before each, I'm going to set this random each variable, and then I'm just going to write out those variables for each test. And now when I execute this, what you're going to see is the random all variable that I output first is actually the same for each test, since that before all was run once at the beginning. And then each time the test runs, we're setting random each, and then that is different for each test. So this is how you pretty much would set up your Pester 5 tests. and you can set variables, define functions, import modules, that kind of thing, and these will all run in the same scope as your test. All right, so now that we kind of understand the difference between discovery and run, I want to talk a little bit about assertions. So I kind of touched on this a little bit before, where we have the ability to use the should function to actually assert various things. And as you can see here, we have assertions such as be, not be, be exactly, that kind of thing. So there's a bunch of different ones. And you can see this last one, be exactly, is actually failing because the case is different. So usually PowerShell is case insensitive, but if you use be exactly, in this case, it fails because it is not the same. One new thing that has been added in Pester 5 is the ability to use or to continue after a should failure. So usually what happens, at least in Pester 4 and even by default in Pester 5, is if you don't define this error action, it's going to stop on the first failed should block. But in this case, what we're going to actually do is define error action continue. And if I run this now, you'll see that it actually has two errors, because test should be tester is going to fail, obviously, and then one should be 2 is going to fail. And if we look at the output here, you'll see that the strings differ, and also we expected 2 but got 1. If I were to comment out this error action, you'll see that I only see the first should failure. So the idea here is that you could have a bunch of different assertions inside your test, and then you can see all the failures instead of just one. All right. Another new feature for Pester 5 is the ability to use tags everywhere. So I actually have kind of a big example here that I'll paste in here. And this is pretty much because of the discovery phase. We now can kind of check out the entire test setup before we actually run the test, which means that we can start putting tags on everything. So the idea with a tag is that you could have tests that match particular conditions. You may only want to run a certain subset of those tests based on those conditions. And for example, I have this integration context that has 3 integration tests in it, and it has a tag that specifies integration. So if I were to actually do an invoke pester here, and then specify the tag filter, I could actually say integration, and you can see it ran 4 tests, and it didn't run 3 tests. So I actually, if you look here, I have integration tag set on the context here, which is those 3 tests. And I also have a tag set on this particular individual it block for integration. So that's why 4 of the tests run and 3 of the tests were skipped. You can also pretty much pass an array to this. So if I wanted to run the unit and integration tests, you'll see that it runs 6 of the 7 tests. It skipped this long-running tagged test because I just specified those 2 tag filters. Finally, a new feature in Pester 5 is the ability to use wildcards. So if you have Pester tests that start with a certain thing or end with a certain thing, you can now use a wildcard to filter out those tests that you want to run. So I ran 1 test, which is my long-running test, and I didn't run the other 6 tests. All right. Similar to tags, because of the discovery step, we now can put skip on pretty much any block within a test. So skip just skips a test. And you can see here that I have a describe block with a skip on it, so it'll skip all the context and it blocks inside it. I also can skip on the context level, so it'll skip all the it blocks inside this context. And then I can skip on the individual it level, so you can kind of mix and match what you decide to skip. So if I were to run this, you're going to see that it skipped all 3 of my tests in here because I just skipped them on the various levels inside this particular test. All right, another feature of Pester 5 is the ability to use test cases. well, test cases existed in Pester 4, but in Pester 5, what it does is now it implicitly provides variables that are part of the dictionary that you pass in to the test cases parameter. So the idea with the test case is that you may have like several tests that you want to run over a particular section of code. And instead of writing 3 tests here, I can specify multiple test cases with different variables that are then passed into this particular script block. So name will be Adam, Jim, then Sarah. And so it'll effectively run 3 tests with this one it block. Previously, you'd have to have a param block in here, pretty much, to have the name specified. But now with Pester 5, it automatically will just add a name variable to this particular script block. And then when we execute it, you can see one of them will pass while the other 2 test cases will fail. So we had one pass test and 2 failed tests because Adam matched, but Jim and Sarah did not. So that's a handy feature to kind of really increase your test coverage just by creating additional test cases with the same test code inside your script block. All right, so now I want to get into mocking. So mocking is kind of more of an advanced topic in terms of Pester. And I'll talk about various different types of things that you can do with mocks. And some of the new features in Pester 5 around mocks. So first of all, what a mock allows you to do is kind of replace an existing function with something different just for the purposes of a test. So you may have something that goes out and talks to a network resource or some other live REST service or something like that, and you don't want to actually call that because you want to just test your code and not necessarily test the REST service if it's working, or you don't really want to actually execute something on that REST service and have it like manipulate something inside your production environment. So what we do is we can actually use the mocking framework inside Pester to replace that function with something else. So in this example, I have new thing again, and new thing is going to return thing. And in a very basic test, I can just say new thing should be thing, and if I run that, you'll see that it passed. So it returned thing, it called this actual thing, so if I actually set a breakpoint in here, and then I hit that, you'll see that the debugger hits this breakpoint because it's actually calling new thing. But if we look at what a mock can do, is it pretty much will replace that command with a fake command that then we can kind of manipulate how that thing behaves. So we're going to replace new thing with this script block right here, and it's going to return fake thing. So now when I run this, you'll see that the test still passes and it returned fake thing because it called the mock and it didn't call my function. And to prove that, we can click debug test, and you'll see that it didn't actually hit this breakpoint because it didn't call new thing. It actually called the mock instead. Kind of a difference in Pester 5 is the way that you can validate mocks. There used to be a couple other commandlets for asserting that a mock was called and how many times it was called and that kind of thing. But now you can just use the should assertion to actually assert whether or not a mock was called. So in this case, we're kind of asserting the actual result of the mock, but you may want to just validate that a mock was called, and what you can do there is you can actually use this parameter set for should. So again, we mock it, and then we call new thing, and then we say this should have been invoked one time. So if we run that, you'll see that that passes because new thing was invoked right here, and Pester is actually counting the number of times that this particular function was called. Another thing you can do with mocks is actually filter when a mock is called. So I created a new function called new thing, and this actually takes in a parameter of a, and it will just echo out a when it's called. So with a parameter filter, pretty much what you're doing is you want to return true or false from the parameter filter. And in this case, I'm going to check A to see if yes was actually passed in via that parameter. If it was, then we will actually call this mock with. So it allows you to kind of adjust your mock based on some conditions. So for example, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call new thing without setting the A parameter, and then you'll see that if I do should invoke, it's been called 0 times. And then I'm going to call a new thing again, but this time I'm going to specify the A parameter with yes, and since that matches the parameter filter, it will return this fake thing and invoke my mock, and you'll see that it was called 1 time. So one thing to note about this, what's cool in Pester 5 is that you no longer need a param block inside your parameter filter. It automatically sets the params as variables inside that param filter, so it's a lot shorter syntax and a lot less to type. All right, and finally, one of my favorite features here is the ability to debug a mock. So previous versions of Pester pretty much rewrote the script block, so debugging wouldn't work, but it no longer does that. So what you can actually do is you can set a breakpoint inside your mock width, and if I were to click debug test, it will actually break inside that mock. So you actually have the ability to kind of see what's going on inside the mock and debug a mock in case you're having problems getting it to work correctly. So it's another productivity booster inside Pester 5. All right, so now I want to talk a little bit about Pester configuration. I'm not going to get too deep into this. There's a lot of settings that you can put in here, but let's see. What I'm going to do is actually create a config.ps1 file. Whoops. And I'm going to put this invoke Pester call in here. So when you call invoke Pester without specifying like a filter for the path, it's going to actually look for all tests.ps1 files, and that's kind of what I'm doing here. So it's going to run this demo test.ps1. So what you can do is with invoke Pester, which is the main command for like starting Pester tests, like you've seen me, I've just been kind of running Pester either by pressing F5 or clicking this run test button. But to kind of like manually or explicitly invoke a Pester test, you can use invoke Pester, which provides some like additional features in terms of controlling how Pester is invoked, which files are invoked, which tests are invoked, which tags are invoked, that kind of thing. But it also allows you to specify a Pester configuration. So the default Pester configuration can be found with the Pester configuration class here and getting the default property off of it. And if we execute that, what you'll see is we have various sections inside this Pester configuration: run, filter, code coverage, test results, should, debug. If we take a look at one of these, you see that there's a bunch of different settings that we can actually pass in. So rather than having like a million parameters on invoke Pester, you can actually pass in a customized Pester configuration and set the properties of that Pester configuration for invoke Pester. So in this case, I'm going to set the output verbosity to diagnostic, and if I run that, you'll see that it went and started running tests inside my demo.test.ps1, and it provides a whole bunch of other information about this and which tests are going to be run and that kind of thing. So it's a good way to kind of, it's hitting a breakpoint, where you can see like exactly what Pester is doing. So a lot of work was put into actually improving the logging output, so you can see why certain things are happening the way they are, why discovery is happening, why mocking is happening, that kind of thing. So that's Pester configuration. There's a lot more there that you can actually play around with, so you can poke around inside there. All right, and finally, I just want to touch on test output. So before in Pester 4, there were ways to get various types of test output, but it's kind of been standardized and made it a little bit simpler. All you need to do to get output that you might want to upload into a system such as Teams or TFS or Azure DevOps, something like that, where it actually can consume pretty much the NUnit format for XML files and test output. What you can do is you can use the CI parameter of invoke Pester. So when I run this, what you're going to see is it's going to output 2 XML files. And then if you look in here, we have this like test results XML file that has a bunch of information about the test cases, like how long they ran, how many asserts they had, if they were successful, that kind of thing. And it's pretty much a standard format that then you can upload into your test result, CI runner sort of thing, and then you'll get those pretty output of how many tests passed and that kind of thing directly inside the UI usually. It also outputs code coverage if you do have that enabled. I am not using that right now, but yeah, so that is just an example of outputting CI XML for your CI environment. All right, so there is a lot more to Pester and some cool features of Pester 5 that I think you should go check out. I hope this was a good overview of some of the differences between Pester 4 and Pester 5. To be honest, I was a little intimidated when I saw the kind of the upgrade doc from Pester 4 to Pester 5, but after kind of going through and understanding the benefits of Pester 5, I would definitely recommend people to start looking into this and definitely start writing your new tests with Pester 5 rather than Pester 4. So if you like videos like this, definitely subscribe to my channel to learn more about cool modules on Mondays, and we'll be back next week with a new Module Monday.